Good morning. This is the YouTube channel of The Study, myself Aman Jha, and we are going to continue with the NCERT concept series. Today we are going to study the chapter 9 of class 7th history NCERT. Okay, so let's start. To give a brief recap, we have studied till now some of the important trends, major political changes during the time of early medieval period, Delhi Sultanate, Mughal empires, and then we talked about some important social changes like the urbanization, emergence of new crafts, the relationship between tribes, nomads, and settled communities, and then we talked about the Bhakti movement here in the eighth chapter. Okay, and here in chapter 9 we are going to focus on the making of regional cultures. Okay, now obviously we have 28 states and 8 union territories in the country, so we are not going to focus on each and every regional culture, but we will look into some of the examples of how regional cultures have evolved in this period. If you recall, when we were discussing the some of the major trends that will be visible during these in the history of medieval period, we had talked about this topic called region and empires. And here we had said that the regional impulses and imperialistic impulses often clashed with each other, but often they led to the creation of new cultures and new systems as well. So that is what we are going to see in this chapter. Okay. To begin with, we will start with a brief discussion, and then we will see the emergence of a regional language in the form of Malayalam. Then we will look into the example of a regional cult and the development of a regional tradition around a religious cult. Then another form of culture based on the values of heroism, another regional culture. Then an element of culture that is common across regional fronts, but it has some regional variations. The story of Kathak, we will see that how it has emerged, it has some commonalities, but across regions it has some variations as well. And then we will see the concept of painting, some of the regional schools of painting, and at last we will give a closer look to the province of Bengal, and here we will see the emergence of regional language. We will see the relationship between peers and peasant communities, that how agriculture and religion expanded, and then we will see one of the food habit in terms of how fish is such a strong pull. The fish has such a strong pull that even the Brahminical class was allowed to eat fish. It was given an exception in the case of Bengal. So let's start. Here we are going to focus the regions discussed in the chapter. A, talk about Malayalam here. Then we will talk about the Jagannath cult and the regional culture around it. Then we will look into the Rajput culture based on the values of heroism and valor in this part of the country. Then we will look into the story of Kathak. Now Kathak is both common to the North India. So some of the Uttar Pradesh Gharana and one Rajput Gharana will be discussed. And then we will look into the regional paintings where the Rajput area, the paintings, schools of painting of the Rajput area as well as Pahadi paintings will be discussed. And then at last we will look into the province of Bengal. But before that, we said culture, regional culture, national culture, etc. But first, what is culture and what are its components? See, there are two aspects of culture. One is material culture, another is non-material culture. Okay, or material aspect and non-material aspect. So the material aspect consists of tangible objects like tools, implements, buildings, books, items of day-to-day usage, coins, shirts, anything that you can touch and feel. That is, a material aspect of the culture. These objects are man-made, and therefore we can draw this, dichotomy. So whatever that is not natural is cultural. Suppose you go somewhere, you see a tree and you etch out using a knife or something, you etch out your name on the bark, or you draw your name or somewhere on the stone. that is cultural. So whatever that is not natural is cultural. If you see in the if suppose you are doing an aerial survey of a land and you discover a paleo channel or paleo canal that has now it was covered with sediment, so that is an remnant of culture. So anything that is not natural is cultural. If something is man made, it is part of the material culture. And how do you identify regional cultures on the basis of material remains? For example, if you see coins or if you see inscriptions where regional dynasties or regional kings have inscribed something, or for example in the case of Harappa, we saw seals, ceilings, we saw toys and weights, measures and such things. So this is how regional cultures, for a very common example to identify regional culture with the help of its material aspect is pottery. You identify a typical pottery which is typical to a particular area, then you can say that okay, this was a particular regional culture. Then the other aspect is non-material. It consists of intangible abstract things like customs, traditions, beliefs, values, languages, law, religion, performing art, etc. Difficult to understand only from archaeology. For example, if you recall, while we were discussing the Harappan civilization, we talked about seals. Okay, we said that now seals were used in course of trade to mark the a particular good, that yes, it is being delivered by a genuine third party. But it is also possible that some of the seals represented any particular trading house, or they may have some sort of ritualistic or religious significance. People might have wore them as amulets. So when it comes to understanding the beliefs and values of a society, that is the non-material culture, it becomes difficult to identify it solely on the basis of archaeology. That means you need literary sources as well. Apart from archaeological sources, to understand the non-material aspect of the culture, you will need literary sources as well. Okay, and regional cultures, what will be the example of non-material aspect of a regional culture? Simple, a local language, a locally popular performing art, right? A local custom, such things. So these are the two broad aspects of culture. So when I say dance, so dance is a non-material culture, but architecture, a regional architecture, that is a material aspect of the culture, right? So this is the introduction paragraph. What it says, when we refer to a person as a Tamil or an Oriya, this usually means that he or she speaks Tamil or Oriya and lives in Tamil Nadu or Odisha. We also tend to associate each region with distinctive kinds of food, clothes, poetry, dance, music and painting. This is how you identify a regional culture broadly. Sometimes we take these identities for granted and assume that they have existed from time immemorial. We tend to think that these things are cast in stone and that they are never changing, that the identities are, so especially the social identities, are fixed. But that is not true. They have been changing over a period of time. However, the frontiers separating regions, that also known as regional identities, okay, have evolved over time and in fact are still changing. Also, regional cultures of today are often the product of complex processes of intermixing of local traditions with ideas from other parts of the subcontinent. These are fairly self-explanatory ideas. For example, today someone who says that I am from India, okay, now you mean Dakkan and Hindustan both. But in medieval period, Hindustan meant mainly North India. Similarly, a person who said Bengali, now today a Bengali is from West Bengal. But in medieval period or before partition, a Bengali could have meant from the larger Bengal area, which will include Bangladesh also. So there are such ideas. Also, especially the people who live on the border areas, international border as well as state border, they tend to have common element of the culture of at least the predominant culture of the two states. For example, recently there was this dispute for some border villages between Karnataka and Maharashtra. Now imagine the people living in those border villages. Certainly they will have, their culture will have elements from the Kannada culture as well as Marathi culture, right? Similarly, the tribals living on the border of Gujarat and Maharashtra, they would have elements of both the cultures and maybe some of their own. Now the in medieval period, Khandesh was a strategic location or strategic area, because from there you could access Deccan and rest of the South India. But today Khandesh is partly in Madhya Pradesh and partly in Maharashtra. The culture of eastern UP is more similar to Bihar than you can say Haryana or Punjab. So these cultures keep evolving and they have variations as well. Some traditions appear specific to some regions, others seem to be similar across regions, and yet others derive from older practices but take a new form in other regions. These are commonly understood ideas. Now, the first example we will see is the example of the Cheras and the development of Malayalam language. It is an example of connection between language and region, that how a language specific to a particular region evolves. But before that, who are the Cheras? If you recall, while we were studying the Sangam period in the post-Mauryan age, we talked about Movendar, that is the three chiefs. Movendar means three chiefs. Had one speciality about them was that they had one interior as well as one coastal political center. And how do we know about them? What are our sources? Our sources are Sangam poems. Right? The poets of Sangam poems eulogize these three chiefs because these three chiefs patronized them, they gave them gift, they appointed them. Okay, so they had this symbiotic relationship with these chiefs. In Sangam poems, we get mention of these chiefs. Okay, now who were these three? They were Chol, Chera, and Pandya. Now, in post-Gupta period, in early medieval period, these three names also appear once again. We had Chola Empire, we had Chera kings, and we had Pandyan state as well. Now, it could be that the states in early medieval period, or the kings and the ruling class of the early medieval period states, were actually descendants of the Movendars, or since these Movendars were very popular, therefore people tried to get legitimacy for their rule. So they linked up themselves with the Movendars of post-Mauryan period. It could be either. They could actually be descendants, or they could have simply linked up their name with the names of popular chiefs of post-Mauryan period. For example, if you recall the example of Gurjar Pratihar, if you recall the concept of Brahmachhatra, if you recall the concept of Suryavanshi and Chandravanshi, among the Rajputs, there is this idea of Agnikul Rajputs, that they were born from the sacrificial fire alt. So such origin myths are constructed to gain legitimacy, or it is possible that they might actually be descendants of the ancient families. Now, the Chera kingdom of Mahodaipuram, which is the modern Kodungalur in Kerala, okay, was established in the 9th century. The rulers introduced the local Malayalam language and script in their inscriptions. This is one of the earliest examples of the use of a regional language in official records. But why were they inscribing inscriptions? Why were inscriptions being written? Where were they written? Obviously on hard surfaces like stone, on temple. Now that stone could be a part of the temple wall, okay, or some freestanding stone. Where else? If you recall, copper plate inscriptions. And why they, or any other kind of donative inscription, or they could be making an announcement, etc. Why were they made? To give land grants to individual Brahmins, land grants to temples and monasteries, making grants to their officers, such things. So in their inscriptions, they started using a local language. This is one of the earliest example of the use of a regional language in official records. So what was happening before this, if this is the earliest example? See, if you recall, at the time of Ashok, especially in the Ashokan inscriptions, he has used Prakrit, Brahmi script, Prakrit language in mainland India, and in the northwest he had Kharoshthi script and Greek, Aramaic, these languages. But in the post-Mauryan period, Rudradaman, he was an Shaka king. He repaired the lake in the Girnar area, okay? And he was the first person, and next to that lake he inscribed a long inscription in pure Sanskrit. And there he says that this Sudarshan lake, it is in the Girnar region, was originally commissioned by Chandragupta Maurya, and he admits that I am only repairing it. And there he has given this first inscription in Sanskrit. Now this practice of Sanskrit inscriptions continued even during the Gupta period. Sanskrit inscriptions were mostly in Sanskrit. It is only in the early medieval period, when regional languages had started popping up, okay, they now started using regional languages in their inscriptions. If you recall, we had talked about the Chola inscription, in which the top part was in Sanskrit and the rest of the details were filled in Tamil. So this was the practice of issuing Sanskrit inscriptions was practiced during Gupta period as well. But up to the early medieval period, small changes started happening, and they have given one example here. And even Cholas were using Tamil in their inscription, and that practice continued later. Rashtra Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, they were also adopting regional languages. And this happens throughout the medieval period. More and more kings start using regional languages. In Bengal, they start using Bengali. In the Vijayanagar period, or in the Bahmani Sultanate, they started using Marathi. In Bahmani Sultanate, as well as the descendant sultanates of Bahmani state, they were also using Marathi. So this is the practice that now regional languages had started appearing in official records. That shows you the growth of original language basically. At the same time, Cheras also drew upon Sanskrit traditions. Now before I go there, I like to highlight this point. The earliest written material that is available from south is in a script called Tamil Brahmi script. There was a northern Brahmi and there was a southern Brahmi. It was called Tamil Brahmi script, and the earliest one are mostly in the Mauryan and post-Mauryan period. They are also called Tamili or Damili. Both names are used for it. It's a script. Now out of this script, 3 scripts have emerged: Tamil, Vatelutu and Grantha. Now these two are used to write Tamil language, and Grantha is used to write Sanskrit. Okay, it appears different from Devanagari script. Okay, the Grantha script is used to write Devanagari script. So at the same time, the Cheras also drew upon Sanskrit traditions. The temple theatre of Kerala, that is, you must have heard the name Kudiyattam when you are reading the art and culture. The things like Kudiyattam, Mohiniyattam, these are some of the dances of the traditional dances of Kerala. But when we say the temple theatre, it is, Kudiyattam is the temple theatre. It borrowed from the stories of Sanskrit epics, meaning the epics like Mahabharata, Ramayana, etc. Okay, so when they are giving their performances, what they do perform a storytelling via their dances. By their performing different postures, their movement of eyes, their movement of head and other parts of the body, they tell stories. And what stories were they telling? Stories from the Sanskrit epics. First literary works in Malayalam, dated to about 12th century, are directly indebted to Sanskrit. Interestingly, a 14th century text called Lila Tilakam, dealing with grammar and poetics, was composed in Manipravalam. which literally means diamonds and corals, referring to two languages, Sanskrit and the regional language. It is a hybrid language written in the Grantha script. Okay, the Grantha script was originally used to write Sanskrit. So this is a hybrid language which is, so it is widely believed that Malayalam has emerged from a generous mixing between Tamil and Sanskrit. So they are saying their earliest work is composed in Maniprabalam, a hybrid language out of Sanskrit and regional language. Okay. Here we talked about epics. So before that I will, and these are Tamil epics. Okay. But before these cultures came to the stage of writing epics, there were some others. For example, it's called Pati Nen Milkanakku. This is the Sangam literature. Ettu Tokoi means 10 anthologies, Pattu Papattu means 10 idyls, means long poems, and Tolkapia means a Tamil grammar. Then came the Pati Nen Kilkanakku, including Tirukkural. Now the Tirukkural written by Thiruvalluvar is often in news. There was some political controversy regarding his statues some year back. It is a Tamil, it's a work on ethics and morality. And then comes the epics. As gradually they move from Sangam literature through Pati Nen Kilkanakku, and when they up to the period of Tamil epics, you can see an increasing influence of northern Brahminical influence, and up to the period of epics, that influence had become very strong. So even earlier these temple theatres, they had borrowed from Sanskrit epics, and when they produced their own proper text called Lila Tilakam, then it was also written in a language which is hybrid of Sanskrit and Tamil. Okay. So the case in point here is, what is the story here when we are discussing the Malayalam? What we are trying to emphasize is that a regional state has adopted a regional language, okay, which is has emerged out of combination between regional element and an element from outside, and eventually it matures, develops into a fully formed language, develops a fully formed script, and then it becomes the main regional identity. Then rulers and religious traditions, the Jagannath cult in Odisha. Regional cultures also grew around religious traditions. An example of this process is the cult of Jagannath. It is a name from Vishnu at Puri. Okay. Now see, this statement is interesting. Regional cultures also grow around religious traditions, and this is what we are trying to understand. To date, local tribals make wooden images of the deity, which suggests that the deity was originally a local god who was later identified with Vishnu. If you recall, when we are discussing the origins of bhakti, okay, then we had talked about Avatarvad, the theory of incarnation, that how tribal gods were, incorporated or fused with a larger pan-Indian, bhakti pantheon. Okay, some will be called avatar of Vishnu, some will be called avatar of Durga or Shiva, or sometimes they will be associated with these gods in the form of, their children or their, another form. In most important Ganga king, Anantavarman decided to erect a temple for Purushottam Jagannath at Puri in 12th century. Subsequently, in 1230 CE, King Anangabhim III depicted his kingdom to the deity, dedicated his kingdom to the deity and proclaimed himself as the deputy of the god. Now imagine, why would a king do such a thing? Okay, why you will construct such a grand temple and then call yourself deputy of the god? That shows that the influence of this regional cult, which is possibly tribal in origin, was so strong that they were trying to give their state a regional identity. Giving a state a regional identity so that it bolsters your control over throne, and also it creates a sense of otherness vis-a-vis the other neighboring kings, so that when they try to conquer you, you can say that look, we are a regional state, we should be independent, and these are interlopers and we have to push them out. So trying to create, the idea is simple, trying to give your state a distinct identity from the previous states in the era and in that area and the other states in your neighborhood. And one important aspect of, though they have not given this example in this book, is Mandala Panji. It is, a kind of historical records with respect to the Jagannath temple. So any historical event since 12th century that is related to this temple, either a grant to this temple or the visit of a king or coronation of a king here or some subsequent or some military attack over it or any subsequent reparation, anything, these are recorded by the officials related to this temple in the form in this book called Mandala Panji, and it is often used by historians to study the regional history of Odisha. Okay, these informations come from that source. As the temple became an important center of pilgrimage, its authority in socio-political matters also increased. Obviously, if you recall, we had talked about the Chola temples, that how they were center of socio-religious, life. All those who conquered Odisha, such as the Mughals, the Marathas, and the English East India Company, attempted to gain control over the temple. Why? Because they felt that this would make their rule acceptable to the local people. And not only they tried to control it, if a ruler wanted to humiliate the kings of Odisha, then they will, attack and desecrate the temple as well. This example of East India Company is very curious. There is this book called Rise and Decline of Colonial Secularism in India, and it says that when the English East India Company acquired this area, it continued the tradition of administrating the temple by the rulers. So even East India Company ruled it for a while. It appointed its priests, it appointed its other administrators. It just as previous kings were imposing a pilgrim tax and using the income for the state purposes, similarly even East India Company was doing it. But many of the missionaries did not like this idea, because they thought that these are pagan beliefs that company should be discouraging. Instead, company is becoming, company is profiting from the income from that temple or from those religious activities. So they started pressurizing the British government and East India Company to suppress these religious practices. But the company knew that, look, if we try to interfere with the religious practices of the people, then there will be a serious vehement pushback. So they came at a compromise in a sense that, okay, we will not, benefit from the income of the temple or any sort of religious practice associated with the temple. Say, if there is, some fees or some donation by the devotees, then state will not take anything out of it. State will not appoint the priest. State will not appoint the administrators and such things. So they said, look, we cannot discourage the religious practices. We cannot diminish the temple, but we will stay away from its administration. So in a way, in a bizarre manner, the colonial secularism emerged, that they separated the state from the, religion. Then the third example is the Rajputs and the tradition of heroism. Okay. In the 19th century, the region that constitutes most of the present day Rajasthan was called Rajputana by the British. Okay. Now you can use the word Brits or you can use the British. However, there are several groups. There is just a clarification that though there are Rajput groups outside Rajasthan and there are many non-Rajput groups in Rajasthan as well. However, the Rajputs are often recognized as contributing to distinctive culture of Rajasthan. These cultural traditions were closely linked with the ideals and aspirations of rulers. From about 18th century, most of the present day Rajasthan was ruled by various Rajput families. If you recall that first there was a tripartite struggle after the death of Harsha. Okay, they were trying to control the Kannauj region. There were three participants in it: Rashtrakuta dynasty from Deccan, Palas from their center in Bengal, and then Gurjar Pratihar. They were controlling most of the North India. Now, the Gurjar Pratihars had many feudatories, and once the Gurjar Pratihar dynasty declined, these feudatories, occupied or became sovereign in their respective areas. There were Chandelas, there were Tomars, there were Chauhans, right? There were Chalukyas in Gujarat area, there were Parmars, there were Gadwals, okay? And then even they had their own feudatories. So, they are saying from about 18th century, most of the present day Rajasthan was ruled by various Rajput families. Prithviraj Chauhan of Chauhan dynasty, who was ruling from Ajmer area and eventually took Delhi from Tomars, is one such example. These rulers cherished the ideal of hero who fought valiantly, often choosing death over retreat in the battlefield. See, the thing with identity is, suppose you are trying to construct an identity. You can do it in a variety of ways. One is, you can do it through, elements like ethnicity, element like religion, right? Element like which language you speak, how you look, what clothes you wear. There are different ways of constructing identity. But Rajput class constructed an identity based on values, the values of heroism, value of valor, valuing, fighting to the death. Instead of retreating, you fight to the death. Okay, so you construct an identity around values, not the language you speak, not the religion you follow. Because the thing is, if you say that okay, any Hindu can become a Rajput, that is a problem, because you have to be a member of the ruling class. Now, who is joining the ruling class? If you recall, we had talked about that the social causes of origin of Rajput class are very complex. Some are the descendant of ancient Kshatriya class. Some joined the ruling class who came to India during post-Mauryan period, and then like Hunnic invasions, during the Hunnic invasions in post-Gupta period. So there were foreign elements as well. There were local tribal chiefs who became powerful and then joined the Rajput class. We had seen the example of Gadkatanga. Then there were some who were given land grants, and they gradually became, they had internal autonomy, so they gradually became ruler in their area. And all these groups of people, the four categories we mentioned, they had their own lineages and their own relatives, their own local networks of patron-client relationship. So they will also join the Rajput class. So this class was very open. Whoever came to rule a particular area joined the Rajput class. They performed certain other rituals like, adopting a Rajput name, adopting a certain title, performing certain sacrifices, marrying into other Rajput families. So that was an open class. So how do you construct an identity? You can't use ethnicity because you come from different ethnic backgrounds. You can't say ki anyone who is you can't use religion. You can't use a language because again you will be speaking different dialect and different languages. So an identity based on values was created. Okay, and since it was a ruling class, since it was a ruling class, so there were only certain values that you could choose from, right? Values like heroism, values like valor, the courage, okay, values like saying that we are upholding the Varnashram Dharma, such things. Okay, then this we talked about during 8th century. From 8th century, different Rajput lineages were ruling. Then during Delhi Sultanate, they had a proper regular conflict with Delhi Sultanate. Every now and then a certain ambitious Delhi Sultanate king will come, defeat a few Rajput states, but the moment he died or became weak, they will again become independent. So there was a stalemate, a very long stalemate. After Delhi Sultanate, what happened, that there was this triangular struggle between the Malwa Sultanate, the Gujarat Sultanate, and the Mewar. So then Mughals came. Under Mughals, especially under Akbar, most of these states were incorporated into the Mansabdari system, and most of these Rajput states were, they were returned their own state as Watan Jagir. So practically there is no transfer of territory. There is no transfer of sovereignty of territory. You will retain sovereignty of your territory but that will be called your Watan Jagir, and if state asks you to perform additional duties, you will be given additional Jagirs. Okay, so in a way they retained their own land but nominally became part of the Mughal Empire. So the rule of a particular ruling class, the Rajput ruling class, continues over a very long period. Rajputs came from various socio-political and ethnic backgrounds. Therefore, it was a value-based dynamic class, meaning if a particular group joined the ruling class, therefore it will become part of the Rajput class. But gradually, stories about Rajput heroes were recorded in poems and songs which were recited by specially trained minstrels, what you call Charan Bhat, etc. Okay, these preserved the memories of heroes and were expected to inspire others to follow in their examples. Ordinary people were also attracted by these stories. Therefore, it gets you legitimacy as a ruling class. If ordinary people accept these. But the book gives, book asks a very interesting question, that did women find a place within these stories? It says that sometimes they figure as causes for conflict, that often men will try to capture them and other men will try to protect them. You had already seen so many controversial movies and stuff on this issue. Women are also depicted as following their heroic husbands in both life and death. That is the practice of sati. Now look, the practice of sati could be traced to the Gupta period itself. There is this Iran inscription of a Gupta king, Bhanugupta, where we think that the institution of sati is described. Okay, but up to the medieval period, it had become quite common, especially in the Rajput class. Okay, tracing genealogies, keeping records of reigns of the rulers, cultural exchanges with Mughals, etc., gradually turned a value-based dynamic class into a closed social group based on strong cultural values. So from a dynamic to a closed group, that now the membership to the class had become exclusive, because there were not many changes in the ruling classes. The people that became the ruling class in different states continued their their line of rulership, and in this way a dynamic class where anyone who joined the ruling class became part of the Rajput class eventually became an exclusive club. But still it was based on values of the cultural values of heroism, etc. Now there is this interesting argument. Some historians say that this practice of tracing genealogies and keeping records, there is some Mughal inspiration behind it, because if you recall, even Mughals were very much into tracing their genealogy. They were very proud to trace their genealogy to Temur. Okay, different Mughal Badshah got their paintings made with Temur. If you recall, during the we had seen one example that Aurangzeb is sitting at one end, and starting from Temur you have 10 to 12 Mughal Badshah in the line. So this practice of tracing genealogies, recording the history of any particular ruler in detail in biographies, such practices may have some inspiration from the Mughal side. And since once you become very much fascinated with tracing genealogy, the class will automatically become exclusive, because every new entrant to the class will have to create a genealogy. You have to prove that your ancestors had done something heroic, where your ancestors were ruling a particular area. So gradually this open dynamic class, which is essentially based on values, becomes an exclusive class. Okay, and then on the basis of, but you say, how do you create a culture? We are talking about a regional culture. We here discussed the evolution of a closed social class based on warrior and heroism values, because see, this class creates a foundation of a culture. Think about the songs that will be created. Think about the material culture of the place. Think about the the costumes and sartorial and gastronomical practices based on a habit of a class. Say a particular class, say a dominant class of a place prefers to knit a turban in a particular way, and the other class will follow that practice. say a particular class has a warrior mindset, so definitely the weapons will be glorified in that scenario, right? The palaces, the stories of charans and bhats. So this is how a dominant class and its practices, its material and non-material values generate a larger picture, a larger culture for that area. Beyond the regional frontiers, the story of Kathak. Now we will see a story where a cultural practice and art has, it is spread across different regions, but it has certain variations as well. Just as heroic traditions, dances can also be found in different regions in different forms. For example, Kathak, which is now associated with several parts of North India. The term Kathak literally means a storyteller. Okay? The Kathaks were originally a caste of storytellers. Now see, the caste of storytellers in temples of North India. If you recall that we have time and again talked about that how there has been a proliferation of castes on the basis of craft. That means if you perform a particular craft and generation after a generation, a community keeps performing that particular craft and they become specialized in it, then over a period of time, on the basis of that craft, you become a member of a caste, and then you are arranged somewhere in the caste hierarchy based on the economic and political importance of your craft. Something similar has happened here, that a particular now this must have started as a community, that job of storytelling, but then gradually turn into a caste. They embellished their performances with gestures and songs. Okay, Kathak began evolving into a distinct dance mode in 15th and 16th centuries with the spread of Bhakti movement, because the Bhakti movement will give you a certain themes, the certain themes around which your songs will be written, a certain themes around which you will make certain hand gestures or gestures of eyes, etc. Especially the Krishna Bhakti tradition within the Saguna Bhakti. For example, Jayadev's Geet Govind. Now it is a story of Krishna and Radha. If you recall, we had talked about that this is the first time. It was written in 12th century, but it was the first time that Radha was given so much importance. In the earlier works on Krishna, either it be Harivansh or Vishnu Puran or any other things, the Radha, there might be some indirect references to Radha. Okay, there are lots of references to gopis, but Radha truly arrives in Geet Govind. And the romantic tales of Krishna and Radha became the centerpiece of art and activities like bhajan writing, activities like kirtan, activities like painting. So from that point onwards, the romantic tales of Krishna and Radha become a true theme of art. This will inspire paintings as well. We will see it shortly. Not only the bhajan writing, not only singing and dancing, but it will inspire painting as well. Okay, emergence of Ras Leela. For example, earlier we said that they used to embellish their performance with gestures and songs. So you are telling story. Which story will you tell? You will tell the story of Krishna and Radha and such other things, right? Such similar stories. Sometimes you will create analogy. We will see the example of Bunny Thani later when you are talking about painting. So you have new stories. Now on the basis of bhakti, since there are songs of Meera or there are songs of other bhakti saints, you will sing those songs. And to sing those songs or tell your stories, they are not standing somewhere and telling story. Through their movements and through their motions, through their expressions, they are trying to tell a story. Emergence of Ras Leela in the Braj or Mathura region was an important development. While telling, so it was a popular development, and gradually Ras Leela also inspired Kathak. While telling the legends of Radha Krishna, it combined folk dance with basic gestures of Kathak storytellers. Okay. Now, under the Mughal emperors and their nobles, Kathak was performed in the court, where it acquired its present features and developed into a form of dance with a distinctive style. See, now, if you might think Mughal emperors and their nobles, this was primarily a Muslim nobility class. But in their courts, you had stories of Krishna and Radha being told via Kathak. So, when we say a composite culture or the words like Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb, this is what they mean. That ruling class, it wanted to be entertained. and regardless of what was the original inspiration behind a particular form of entertainment or particular aesthetic style, they encouraged it. Subsequently, it developed into two traditions or gharanas, one in the court of Rajasthan, say Jaipur, and another in Lucknow. They have not given the example of Banaras, but if you look up this source called CCRT on internet, okay, I don't recall its full form, Center for Cultural Resources and Training perhaps, but if you look on this website of CCRT, you will see they are mentioning Banaras Gharana as well. Under the patronage of Wajid Ali Shah, the last Nawab of Awadh, the state of Awadh was created when the Mughal Empire declined. It grew into a major art form. The CCRT says there are some minor differences. For example, in the Jaipur Gharana, their focus is on the movement of foot, but in the other two Gharanas, they focus on the hand movement and eyes movement. Now, again, we are not studying the history of art. We are trying to study the development of regional identities or regional cultural elements. So, therefore, I think this much knowledge is already enough. And this idea of Gharana, when you are studying art and culture, you will study music. In music, you will talk about two sorts of music, Hindustani and Carnatic. In Hindustani music, there is a concept of gharanas, and there are 5 to 6 gharanas, and the story is similar. Different regional states patronized different forms of. First, there was the Mughal rule. See, when we were talking about the Mughal Empire, we started by discussing that why it was important, and there we said that the traditions and institutions encouraged and molded by Mughals were not only adopted by subsequent rulers, but in fact, they became an institutions in their own right. So this is something similar with Hindustani music as well. That first Mughal patronized it. We will see the example of painting now in a while. First, Mughals will patronize it, Mughal noble class, not only Basha. Then it will, once the Mughal state declined, it was, adopted by regional states, and there in separate states, they will develop their some distinct characteristics as well. By the third quarter of 19th century, it was firmly entrenched as a dance form not only in these two regions, but in adjoining areas of present-day Punjab, Haryana, J&K, Bihar and Madhya Pradesh. Emphasis was laid on intricate and rapid footwork, elaborate costumes, as well as enactment of stories. Kathak, like many other cultural practices, was viewed unfavorably by British administrators in 19th, 20th century. Like other cultural practices, for example, Bharatnatyam. Okay, they used to think that Bharatnatyam, since it was mainly performed by Devdasis attached to different temples, they thought that maybe this is some sort of prostitution, so they banned it. And some of the well-meaning Indians who wanted to bring modernity to India, they also mistook or misunderstood these traditions, and they saw it from a very narrow prism. So they also encouraged the British government, and the British government who anyway wanted to kill the identity of Indians and turn them into a brown babu. So they also, whenever they got the opportunity, they interfered with these regional these cultural practices. So it was viewed unfavorably. However, it survived and continued to be performed by courtesans. Since they were performed by courtesans, therefore the British, who saw this just as a form of they thought it is some sort of debauchery. They thought that this is not refined cultural practices, but they saw it something as a very superficial, because they saw it from their own prism, and was recognized as one of the 6 classical forms of dance in the country after independence. The others are Bharatnatyam, Kathakali, Odissi, Kuchipudi, and Manipuri. See, the reason why British or the modernist Indians, the Indians were mostly they had good intention. They wanted to modernize India. It's just that some of their means perhaps were, with the benefit of hindsight, not so smart. But in the case of British, what happened, that they saw everything from their own prism. They had kingship back home. So they thought that all the kingship should be such. Now in the court of their kings, they would not have these ritualistic performances by courtesans. So they thought, okay, these courtesans are prostitutes, and whatever art they perform is tainted by the association. Similarly, if a certain dance or other cultural activities being done in temple by women who are attached to the temple, they will think, okay, this is, this is also some kind of debauchery, because in their religion it was not common. So they saw it from a very narrow prism, and therefore they viewed these things unfavorably and discouraged it. In any case, once the regional states declined, so what happens that since states and the ruling class is patron of these arts, so once they decline, the performers of these arts will not have a patron. Okay, their lifestyle, the quality of their lifestyle will suddenly decline. So these arts, they will anyway struggle to sustain these arts, and then you have a ruling class, the new ruling class, that views it unfavorably. So that is a major cause of decline. Another, painting. Here also you will see regional variations, especially the miniature paintings. Another tradition to develop in different ways was that of miniatures. Miniatures are small sized paintings, generally done in watercolor on cloth or paper. The earliest miniatures were on palm leaves or wood. Okay, some of the most beautiful of these found in Western India were used to illustrate Jain texts. That means, say you have a textbook, okay, and this is the page. On this much, you will draw a painting, and in down here, you will write something. Okay, or if it is in the form of scroll, then in some portion of the scroll there will be painting, and then on the rest of it you will write. In fact, even the Pala school of art, especially in Vajrayana Buddhism, they had these scrolls in which they will have painting as well as writing. Also, if it's not a scroll, if it is a birch, then you will bind them with first you will make hole in the birch, you will bind it with the rope, and on each birch piece you will have, on certain portions you will have miniature painting, and on the rest of it you will have writing. See, if we talk about painting, the earliest surviving example is obviously rock cut paintings of prehistoric age. Then if we come to Harappan period, obviously since Harappans were such refined people, they would have practiced painting. Okay, but the problem is they would have painted on perishable surfaces, the things that will decompose. So we don't have evidence of painting from Harappa, but it's common sense that painting is one of the most common way of expressing yourself. It's one of the most common art. So if an art was being practiced in prehistoric period, then a first urban civilization of India would definitely be doing some art activity. If they can make toys, right? If they can make such standard seals, if they can plan so well, all right, if they can organize so much, then definitely they would have painted. It's just that those paintings haven't survived. Okay, then what is the first example of a surviving painting which survives till day? It is Ajanta. And why it survives? Because of the technique. It is made on rock surface, the frescoes, etc. Okay, so in the case of painting, what is more important than what has survived? Painting would have definitely continued since the prehistoric period. You cannot say that, okay, for a certain period in history people forgot to paint. No, that is just not possible. They would have painted, but they would have painted on perishable surfaces that don't survive anymore. Okay, so the oldest surviving example in historical period is Ajanta. In Ajanta, again, themes are religious. Therefore, when we say that the earliest are Jain, and though this example is not given in the book, but even Vajrayana Buddhism, especially in the Pala period of Bengal, you recall Palas were one of the participants of tripartite struggle. After Palas came the Senas. Palas were patronizing Buddhism. In this year's mains, there was a question on the relationship between Palas and Buddhism. Okay, so under their rule, the miniature paintings were being done by Vajrayana Buddhists as well. Then during the Sultanate period, though very few examples survive, but these are the examples of illustrated manuscripts. Examples like Nimmat Nama, it is a book on cookery and such other aesthetic activities. What they do, they paint on certain pages, and then on certain pages they write, and also then they will paint on the half of the page and write on the half of the page. Then this is Miftah al-Fizla. This is a dictionary of rare words. But the beauty is that it is an illustrated dictionary. So if it is demonstrating a charkha, then it will draw a charkha. Okay. Then you have Kalpa Sutra. It is though a Jain book, it is a Jain text, but it is, illustrated. And surprisingly, all the three, Nimmatnama, Miftah al-Fuzla or Kalpa Sutra, they were produced under Malwa Sultanate. Okay. If you recall, when with the death of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, many of the regional states, rebelled and they established their own sultanate. So Gujarat, Malwa, Bengal, these were regional sultanates. So certainly during if during in Malwa Sultanate you had illustrated manuscripts, definitely during the Delhi Sultanate period they must have been making them, but though we don't have any famous one that survives. After this period, the Mughal emperors Akbar, Jahangir and Shah Jahan patronized. See, let's see the example first. See here, on a part of the painting, a part of the page, this is one full page, they have painted, but here they have written something. Okay. Mughal emperors Akbar, Jahangir and Shah Jahan patronized skilled painters who primarily illustrated manuscripts. Okay, same. Manuscript means, again, it means handwritten. Okay. Manuscript is not synonymous with original. It means handwritten. Manu in Latin, it means hand. Okay. So they were written in hand and they were painted by hand as well. And they were illustrated, means they will illustrate with paintings, or paintings, and then you will have writing. All these three, Nimmatnama, Miftah al-Fuzla or Kalpa Sutra, they are all illustrated manuscripts. These were generally painted in brilliant colors and portrayed court scenes, battle, hunting and royal processions and ceremonies and other aspects of social life. They were often exchanged as gifts and were viewed only by exclusive few. So it was not popular work. The emperor and his close associates. See, Akbar had created a translation department, and if you recall, Humayun, when he had come back from Iran, he had brought Iranian painters. Okay, so certainly the already prevalent practice of illustrated manuscripts, plus the Iranian influence, and due to the confluence of these two, a new wave of art started under Mughals. Here, if you can see, Akbar is sitting here. He has gone on a hunting expedition. You have these cheetahs that were domesticated for hunting activity. Now see, in this one, the focus is on landscape. Even though Akbar is sitting in the middle, they have not done anything to highlight him in particular, right? Their focus is on landscape. They are giving due importance to trees, other people, animals like elephant, cherry and cheetahs, etc. Also, we said one thing here, that the earliest surviving miniatures are Jain texts and from the Vajrayana Buddhism, their text. But during the Sultanate period, we gave the examples of Malwa Sultanate, Nimmatnama, Miftah al-Fuzla. During Akbar's time, we say that their themes are rather secular. They are portraying court scenes, they are portraying battles, hunting. Example of hunting we saw, royal processions and ceremonies. But why they are not painting on religious themes? Why during Sultanate period and during Mughal period they were not painting on religious themes? It's because in Islam it is forbidden to paint, so their focus was on secular paintings, whereas that is not in the case of Jainism and Buddhism. So their miniatures were focused on religious themes. And therefore, once the painters migrated from the Mughal court to the regional courts, once again the religious themes became the center stage of art activity. With the decline of Mughal Empire, many painters moved out to the court of regional states. As a result, Mughal artistic tastes influenced the regional courts of Deccan and Rajput courts. At the same time, they retained and developed their own characteristics in terms of what color they were using, what themes they were using, the manners in which objects and individuals were painted, etc. Okay. So in these manners, they retained their own characteristics. Portraits of rulers and court scenes came to be painted following the Mughal example. Besides, themes from mythology and poetry were depicted at centers such as Mewar, Jodhpur, Bundi, Kota and Kishangarh. Okay, themes from mythologies, themes from Puran, themes from Mahabharat, Ramayana, Krishna and Gita Govind, etc. I have given one example of Bani Thani type of painting. It is from this Kishangarh school of painting. So there was this painter called Nihal Chand, who sometimes around 1750 painted a lot of paintings around his patron Raja Samant Singh and Bani Thani. He was a courtesan of Raja Samant Singh, and here they are themed on Krishna and Radha. Here his patron and his patron's courtesan are themed on the basis of Radha and Krishna. See, this is here. This is a Bani Thani school of painting. Okay, is an example of it. That Samant Singh stands for Krishna and vice versa, and Bani Thani stands for Radha and vice versa. Another reason, in 2018 they had asked the question that Bani Thani is associated, the theme Bani Thani is associated with which school of painting? So the answer is Kishangarh. It is in Rajasthan. Another region that attracted miniature paintings was the Himalayan foothills. Up to the Himalayan foothills means the areas of Shivalik hills. Okay, the areas in Jammu, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, etc. Up to the late 17th century, a bold style of miniature painting called Basholi, this is a place in Jammu, had developed in this region. The most popular texts to be painted here was Bhanu Datta's Rasamanjari, Gita Govind and Ramayana. See, from Gita Govind they are getting the inspiration to paint Krishna and Radha, and themes from Ramayana as well, they were being painted. And why are we saying that it was a bold style? It is because the expression on the face of the individuals being painted is rather very expressive. They have retreating hairline, their eyes are bulging, sometimes they are in the shape of a lotus petal. The colors, mostly primary, are very evocative in such sense that this is called bold. But here if you see, it is not bold, it is very the focus is rather well balanced in this one, and here you cannot see much difference between the landscape and this individual's clothing, but there you will see a lot of difference. Then another wave happened. This one, the Basholi school developed up to the late 17th century. But another Pahadi school developed after Nadir Shah's invasion, which was in 1738. So once again lot of painters fled New Delhi and Delhi area, and the conquest of Delhi in 1739, okay, 38-39 the region, resulted in the migration of Mughal artists to the hills to escape the uncertainties of the plains. Here they found ready patrons, which led to the founding of Kangra school of painting. This is in the Himachal area. By the mid-18th century, the Kangra school artists developed a style which breathed a new spirit into miniature painting. The source of inspiration was Vaishnavite traditions. Once again, painting Krishna, Radha, painting themes from Ramayana, etc. Soft colors including cool blues and greens and lyrical treatment of themes distinguish the Kangra painting. And this is the important part. From ordinary women and men painted as well on pots, walls, floor cloths, etc. Works of art that have occasionally survived, unlike the miniatures that were carefully preserved in palaces of centuries. See, whenever you are reading the modern art and culture, you read about things like Mithila school of painting, Worli art. So certainly they have some precedence, and this Worli is on the Gujarat-Maharashtra border, and Mithila is in North Bihar, and such. There are many such examples from Rajasthan, from Bengal, from Andhra. Okay, so these were practiced by people, and some of them have survived, and some of them have changed in their tradition. Now Mithila school of painting is very much recognized. It has been given GI, geographical indication. So even ordinary people painted, and therefore they are called folk paintings. Okay, here is a Kangra Pahadi miniature. See how the human beings are how boldly separated from the nature and stuff. And this is Krishna and this is Radha. Now a closer look at Bengal. First, you will see the growth of a regional language, means the growth of Bengali language. We often identify regions in terms of the language spoken by people. For example, we assume that people in Bengal always spoke Bengali, but certainly it's not so. Bengali has evolved. Early Sanskrit texts from mid-1st millennium BCE, things like Dharma Sutras and etc., suggest that people of Bengal did not speak Sanskritic languages. From the 4th and 3rd century BCE, commercial ties developed between Bengal and Magad, which may have led to the growing influence of Sanskrit. If you recall, then we had given the example of Tamralipti. It was a very important port. And from here, Ashoka's children went to Sri Lanka to preach Dhamma. So, Magad had commercial relationship with Bengal. It was a port. Okay. Later, Gupta rulers established political control over North Bengal and began to settle Brahmanas in this area. There was this Pundravartan Bhukti. Pundravartan Bhukti. Bhukti means in Gupta period a province was called Bhukti, and within a Bhukti there was called Vishay, which was a district. And there is this place called Damodarpur. From Damodarpur, a very, very large number of Gupta copper plate inscriptions have been recovered. And these copper plates, the Damodarpur copper plates, are very useful to study the administration of Guptas, to study the the level of feudalization in Gupta Empire, to study the structure of how the provincial and local administration was being run. So, and this was in North Bengal. So, some of the, for example, the Pundravartan is today in Bangladesh. Okay. So, Gupta rulers had established political control over North Bengal, and they began to settle Brahmanas in these areas, meaning giving land grants, and we have recovered a lot of copper plate land grants, copper plate inscriptions, noting the land grants from this area. Thus, the linguistic and cultural influence from mid-Ganga valley became stronger. So, the influence of Sanskrit starts at this point. In the 7th century, Chinese traveler Xuanzang observed that languages related to Sanskrit were used in all over Bengal. If you recall, we had talked about two Chinese travelers that are important, Fahian and Xuanzang. Both came via Central Asian route of Silk Route. But in the case of Fahian, he went back possibly via the same route, but Xuanzang went via Southeast Asia. So he must have come to Bengal. From there, he boarded a ship, went to Southeast Asia, and from there he went to China. So he must have at least traversed through the Bengal province, and therefore he says that a lot of languages related to Sanskrit were being spoken all over Bengal. From 8th century, Bengal became the center of a regional kingdom under the Palas. In fact, even before Pal, if you recall, the Shashank of Gauda, he was a nemesis of Harshvardhan. So this was also a regional culture, a regional kingdom. Okay. Then from Palas you had Senas, and then you had under Bakhtiyar Khalji there was for a brief period there was a local rule. Between 14th to 16th centuries, Bengal was ruled by independent sultans. What happened when Muhammad bin Tughlaq died? The Bengal Sultanate was formed. His successor Firoz Shah Tughlaq tried to recapture it, but he failed. And then for almost 200 years, right up till Akbar again showed at the doorsteps of Bengal, Bengal was ruled by independent sultans, and they created a very unique local identity. It formed when Akbar conquered Bengal, it formed the nucleus of Bengal Suba. Bengal Suba means it must have included some parts of modern Jharkhand, Bihar and Odisha, just as during the time of British. So during Akbar, this place was the nucleus of Bengal Suba. his minister Mansingh established his capital at Rajmahal. It is currently at the border of West Bengal and Jharkhand. While Persian was the language of administration, Bengali developed as regional languages, means spoken by people. By 15th century, Bengali group of dialects means came to be united by a common literary language. A literary language means how it is written. Dialect is how you speak. So now there are small dialects. See, North India has lot of dialects, but if you say in terms of language, the literary language, so Hindi is the predominant literary language. Something is being said here. Based on the spoken language of western part of the region known as, so the language that was spoken mainly in West Bengal, that gave a literary basis. That means you will use the script, which is based on the West Bengal part of the landscape. And thus, although Bengali is derived from Sanskrit, it passed through several stages of evolution. Also, a wide range of non-Sanskritic words of tribal origin and words from Persian, European languages became part of modern Bengali. Early Bengali literature may be divided into two, one indebted to Sanskrit and other independent of it. The first includes translation of Sanskrit epics like Mahabharata, Ramayana, Puran, etc. Mangal Kavya. Obviously, as the name suggests, it has a Sanskrit origin. Literary auspicious poems dealing with local deities. So you can see it is about local deities, but the name is Mangal Kavya. So you can see some, bhakti impact here on this one. And literary bhakti literature such as biography of Chaitanya Dev, also called Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He was also a Krishna Bhakti, proponent of Krishna Bhakti. The second includes Nath literature. In the last lecture, we had talked about that the Nath, Siddha and Yogi, they represented the popular element of religion in North India, in northern part of India before the arrival of popular bhakti movement from south. So obviously even Bengal, the Nath literature represented the popular movement, such as Mainamati and Gopi Chandra, stories concerning worship of Dharma Thakur, and fairy tales, folk tales and ballads. Texts belonging to first category are easier to date, okay, but belonging to second category, they mostly circulated orally and cannot be precisely dated. They were particularly popular in eastern Bengal, okay. So here we saw the evolution of language, that earlier the people of this area did not speak Sanskrit, they speak non-Sanskritic languages, but gradually the influence of Sanskrit increased, and then up to the medieval period they had two sorts of literature, one which was highly indebted to Sanskrit and another which was mostly of local origin. But since the Sanskrit works are, you have many of the copies of it, you can trace exactly when they were composed, whereas the native literature, which is largely of local origin, since it was orally transmitted for a very long time, so it is difficult to tell when it was created. So first we saw evolution of language, and now we will see the concept of peers and temples. From 16th century, people began to migrate in large numbers from less fertile western Bengal to the forested and marshy areas of southeastern Bengal. There are some historians that say that this migration was possibly due to changes in geomorphology. They say that since the Ganga system started moving eastward, okay, the channels in the western Bengal, they were sedimented, and even today you see that the rivers move their course. So they say that as the rivers were moving more and more eastward, the western part of the Bengal area was becoming moribund, whereas the eastern part was becoming more and more fertile, more and more dynamic. Some historians say that the change in geomorphology and river course was the reason for this migration. As they moved eastward, they cleared forests and brought the land under rice cultivation. Gradually, local fishing, hunting and shifting cultivation based communities turned to peasant societies steered by pioneer settlers. We keep talking about peasantization of tribal societies. That means they shun or at least considerably reduced their dependence on the previous activities like hunting, fishing, and subsistence agriculture, and moved towards a proper agriculture, as agriculture being the mainstay of their economic activity. And these were done by pioneer settlers. Earlier in ancient India and in early medieval period, we talked about land grants. This was something similar to land grants, but we will see here how. This coincided with the establishment of Mughal control over Bengal, with their capital in the heart of eastern delta at Dhaka. See, earlier, as we said, their capital was at Rajmahal when Mansingh under Akbar brought this area under control. But under Jahangir, they tried to move into eastern Bengal. See, Rajmahal is at the border of Bengal and at the border of West Bengal and Jharkhand. So they could not have control that far from that location. So they moved their capital to Dhaka, and from there they tried to control the entire Bengal Delta. Okay, so the center of political control moved to Dhaka. Then officials, functionaries, and other pioneer settlers that included Sufis, peers, entrepreneurial people, military minded people, they received Jagir, which was often tax free. See all the features of land grants, right? And they often set up mosques that served as centers for economic and religious changes in these areas. If you recall, we had talked that how in ancient India and in early medieval period, the tribal societies, they were becoming part of peasant societies. Their gods were being incorporated into an all India pantheon, right? Through Avatarvad and other practices. The Puranas were, adopting their stories, and they're creating, they were fusing these element, the local element and the larger Brahminical element, and creating new modes of worship. And the tribes were becoming part of, a caste-based society. Something similar is happening here also, that these pioneer settlers are, they were erecting their mosques, they were, settling the tribals in one way, as settled societies, and social as well as economic as well as religious changes were taking place. This established order on an unsettled frontier. These community leaders, okay, now they could be anyone, they could be religious persons, they could be military officials, they may have brought a large number of followers with them, they could be officials, also functioned as teachers and adjudicators. See here also you see element of local autonomy. Okay, their followers sometimes ascribed them with supernatural powers. People referred to them with affection and described them as peers. This term included saints or Sufis and other religious personalities, daring colonizers and deified soldiers, various Hindu and Buddhist deities, and even animistic spirits. Now, an animistic spirit means you attribute life or soul to rather inanimate objects like elements of nature, things like trees, stones, elements of nature like thunder, wind, or animals. So when you attribute soul and life to such elements, you say that this is an animistic belief. The cult of Pir became very popular, and their shrines can be found everywhere in Bengal. The legends associated, this is the line that I have adopted from a different book. The legends associated with these local peers often attributes introduction of wet rice cultivation in these regions. So the people that brought wet rice cultivation, that brought a new way of life, the agricultural way of life to these areas, many of them became popular locally in the form of local saintly figures. Bengal also witnessed a temple building spree from late 15th century to early 19th century, which culminated in 19th century. The temples and other religious structures are often built by individuals and groups who were becoming powerful to both demonstrate their power and proclaim their piety. Many of the modest brick and terracotta temples in Bengal were built with the support of several low social groups such as Kolu and Kansari. The coming of European trading companies created new economic opportunities. Remember, we talked about the 17th century commercial revolution that in some part of India created prosperity, and ironically that regional prosperity contributed to the decline of Mughal Empire. So this is what we are talking about, that at local level certain communities, certain social groups that availed the opportunities created by this, arrival of European companies. They became, socially mobile, and to assert their power, to claim their piety, they constructed many temples. As their social and economic position improved, they proclaimed their status through the construction of temples. Often, sociologists use this word Sanskritization. What it means that an upwardly mobile social group often adopts the practices of the forward class or the ruling class of the society, to proclaim that yes, we have arrived, now we are also powerful. Therefore they adopt the practices of ruling class and the higher classes to join their class. This is called Sanskritization. When local deities once worshipped in thatched huts in villages gained recognition of Brahmanas, their images began to be housed in temples. But these temples were built on the model of thatched houses. See, earlier you had thatched houses, they used to be temples. You had huts basically. They were temples. But now see, now you have brick temples, and look at the change in their form, right? The temples began to copy the double roof dochala and chochala structure of thatched huts. If you recall, when we were talking about the rulers and buildings, we said that the Mughal rulers, they liked some of the features of regional architecture and they incorporated those features into imperial architecture. We gave the example of how Jain architecture from Gujarat or Bangla Dome from Bengal was incorporated in the architecture of Fatehpur Sikri. So this is the same thing, the Bangla Dome, and this is the example of Bangla Dome. That this this roof, see the similarity between these two roofs, they are called Bangla Dome. This led to the evolution of typical Bengali style in temple architecture. Both temples and mosque architecture was inspired from locally common thatched huts. In the comparatively more complex four-roof structures, four triangular roof. See, first let's see some pictures. See, you saw this was a hut, and the style of roof was copied in later brick temples as well. See, this is a temple. Now there is some classification of Chala temple. Though Chala means it has two roofs that they come, one this one and one this one. They come together and join in the form of a line. Okay. Then you have Char Chala, means you have four roofs. Now we can see one on this side, but you can imagine there will be three more on three different sides, and they come together at this central point. Then you have 8 Chala, then on the basis of a Chochala you have another Chochala on the top of it. So you have 8 Chala, and then you have 12. I mean, there are 1, 2 and 3 layers. And then you have temples called Jor Bangla. A simple Jor Bangla means 2 Chalas are attached. And then you have a Jor Bangla with a middle pinnacle. This is here. So you have 2 Chalas attached to each other, and at the middle you have this rising structure. Okay, you can see this classification. Okay, in Chala temple you have Do Chala, Char, Cho Chala, then you have 8. It is basically 2, so 2 what we called here Cho Chalas. So you have 2 Cho Chalas, but at the one at the top of the other, and then you have 3, and then you have Jor Bangla. What is that? You have a Do Chalas, you can see this one, okay, and then you can see this one, but they are attached to each other. Similarly, here you have a Jor Bangla, which is, but at the top you have a pinnacle. That pinnacle, see, it can be so evolved. It can be something simple as this. It could be, the pinnacle could be something as simple as this, or it could be something complex as this. Okay. In the comparatively more complex Chochala structure or four-roofed structure, the 4 triangular roofs placed on 4 walls move up to converge on a curved line or a point. What we saw here, that this is one triangular shape here, and we can see only one side. There will be 3 on the 3 other sides, and they come together and converge. Okay. temples were usually built on a square platform. The interior was relatively plain, but the outer walls of many temples were decorated with paintings, ornamental tiles or terracotta tablets. In some temples, particularly in Vishnupur in Bankura district, such decorations reached a high degree of excellence. For example, here, see, this is a Vishnu temple and you have this terracotta decoration. At the center you can see this is Krishna and these are gopis around him. So this is on the outer temple wall. See, the idea of discussing is that how a local architecture evolved. The Bangla Dome is unique to Bengal area, and then only some architectural pieces of Mughal architecture, because they took it from Bengal area. And these huts, they inspired both temples as well as mosques. Not only temples but mosques as well. Some of the Bengal sultans, they constructed their domes in this fashion. What they did, their tomb, what they did at the center, instead of this, they will have a dome on top of it. At last, fish as food. What it simply says that, see, that fish is a staple diet in Bengal area. It is harvested in a very large quantity, found very commonly. Rice and fish are staple diet. In fact, even on the walls of temples and viharas, you have terracotta plaques like this, where you can see that an individual woman is preparing fish to be cooked or to be taken to the market. This is so. See, the Brahmin caste often across India, in North India, West India, everywhere, it is eating non-vegetarian food is a taboo. In certain communities, they even eating onions and such things are taboo. But in the case of Bengal, since fish was a staple diet, that the religion had to make certain adjustments. And this is the beauty of religion. Everything can be, you can create some convenience or exceptions for that. The popularity of fish in the local diet made Brahminical authorities relax this prohibition for the Bengali Brahmins. Brihad Dharam Puran, a 13th century Sanskrit text from Bengal, permitted the local Brahmanas to eat certain varieties of fish. This is how a local culture is developed. From local, the pull of local element. The fact of life was that the fish was so popular among the Bengali people that a religion that was forbidding the priestly class from eating non-vegetarian food from the rest of the country, had to accommodate a regional uniqueness. So the message is simple here. So in this way, we saw three elements of regional culture. In the case of Bengal, we saw the evolution of language, that how with the gradual mixing of Sanskrit and the Brahminical influence, the regional language evolved into something new. Then we saw the influence of peers and the temples, how they were erected, right? We saw how tribal societies were converted into peasant societies, and the communities around the mosques, they turned towards a settled lifestyle. This was a religious or a local element. And then at last we saw that how a local food habit almost compels religion to make a regional exception according to the culture of a region. So this is the end of this chapter. The last chapter of 7th class NCERT will be discussed in the next class. Thank you.